On the night of April 26, 1717, in the howling darkness off the coast of Cape Cod, a ship was dying. She was a three-masted galley called the Whydah, and she had been built for speed. 300 tons of English oak and African mahogany, copper-sheathed against the Dorito worms that ate wooden hulls in tropical waters, rigged for the transatlantic slave trade, and fitted now with 28 cannon. In her holds lay the accumulated plunder of more than 50 captured vessels, chests of Spanish silver, bags of West African gold dust, bales of indigo and ivory, jeweled brooches torn from the coats of merchant captains, and somewhere in the darkness below decks, a fortune that modern historians would eventually estimate at the equivalent of $120 million. She was, at that moment, the richest ship on the Atlantic Ocean, and she was being hammered to pieces by a nor'easter. The storm had come up suddenly, as spring storms do in those waters, a wall of wind and freezing rain that turned the sea into a chaos of white foam and black water. The Whydah had been making for Provincetown, running before the gale with shortened sail when the leadsman's cry came too late. Shoal water, sand. The ship struck once, hard enough to throw men from their feet, and then struck again, and then the sea took her. Her masts went first, the mainmast snapping like a pistol shot, the foremast following, the rigging collapsing into a tangle of rope and canvas that trapped men beneath it. Then the hull began to break. The Whydah rolled onto her beam ends in the surf, her gun deck flooding, her hatches bursting open, and 145 men were thrown into water so cold that it stopped the heart within minutes. The bodies would wash up for weeks afterward. Local farmers and fishermen found them tangled in the wreckage, stripped of their clothes and their gold by the force of the sea, anonymous in death. The treasure came up too, coins scattered across miles of beach, pieces of 8 half buried in the sand, gold dust glinting in the tide pools. The governor of Massachusetts would eventually send soldiers to secure the site, but by then the locals had already picked through much of what the ocean offered up. 2 men survived. 143 did not. Among the dead was the captain of the Whydah, a man who had been born poor in the west of England, who had served his king in war, who had loved a woman he could not afford to marry, and who had, in the space of just over 1 year, become the most successful pirate in recorded history. His name was Samuel Bellamy. He was 28 years old, and his body was never found. This is the story of Black Sam Bellamy, the prince of pirates, the Robin Hood of the sea, the poor man's champion who captured a fortune beyond counting and then died before he could spend a single coin of it. It is a story about ambition and desperation, about love and violence, about the brutal economics of empire and the men who chose to opt out of them. It is a story about what happens when a society creates a class of people with nothing left to lose. And it is a story about waiting, about a woman on a beach watching the horizon, about a ship that never came home, about a fortune that lay buried in the sand for nearly 300 years, waiting to tell us who these men really were. The sources for Samuel Bellamy's life are fragmentary, contradictory, and often colored by the agendas of those who recorded them. The most substantial contemporary account comes from Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, which devotes several pages to Bellamy's career and includes what purport to be verbatim speeches. Johnson's authorship and reliability have been debated by scholars for centuries. Some believe the book was written by Daniel Defoe, others that Johnson was a pseudonym for a maritime insider, still others that the accounts are a mixture of genuine intelligence and sensationalized invention. What can be said with certainty is that Johnson had access to first-hand sources, including trial records and the testimonies of captured pirates, and that his accounts, where they can be checked against documentary evidence, prove broadly accurate, even if the specific details, and especially the dialogue, must be treated with caution. Beyond Johnson, we have court records from the trial of the Whydah survivors, newspaper accounts from Boston and London, colonial correspondence, and the physical evidence of the wreck itself, thousands of artifacts recovered since 1984, many of which confirm details that had previously been known only from written sources. We also have the folklore of Cape Cod, a parallel tradition that preserves the story of Maria Hallett, Bellamy's supposed lover, in forms that range from romantic tragedy to outright witch legend. What we cannot have is certainty. We do not know exactly when Bellamy was born, or where, or to whom. We do not know the full truth of his relationship with Maria Hallett, or whether she existed at all in the form the legends describe. We do not know what he thought or felt in the final moments of his life, as the Whydah broke apart beneath him. We know only the shape of his trajectory: poverty, war, love, desperation, piracy, triumph, and death, and the extraordinary fact of his success, which remains unmatched in the annals of maritime crime. This, then, is a reconstruction. Where the sources agree, we can be confident. Where they diverge, we can only choose the most plausible path and acknowledge that other paths exist. Where they fall silent, we must do the same. The story begins in England, in the West Country, in a world that had no particular use for Samuel Bellamy. The precise date and place of his birth are not recorded. The most commonly cited year is 1689, and the most commonly cited place is Hiddesley, a small village in the parish of Devonshire, though some sources place him elsewhere in the West Country, and others suggest he may have been born slightly earlier or later. What is certain is that he came from the lowest ranks of English rural society, the laboring poor, the people who owned nothing and expected nothing, who worked other men's land and ate other men's bread, and died in the same poverty in which they had been born. Devonshire in the late 17th century was a land of rolling hills and deep valleys, of small farms worked by tenant families, of market towns where wool and cattle changed hands, and of a long, rocky coastline that faced the open Atlantic. It was also a land of profound and grinding inequality. The great families, the Courtenays, the Carews, the Drakes, held thousands of acres, while the families who actually worked that land lived in cottages of cob and thatch, raising children who would work alongside them as soon as they could walk, and who would, if they were lucky, inherit the same tenancy when their parents died. For the youngest sons of such families, there was often no inheritance at all. The land could not be divided indefinitely. There was not enough to go around. And so, the surplus children of the English countryside, the third sons, the fourth sons, the boys for whom there was no place at the family table, went elsewhere. They went to the cities, to London and Bristol and Plymouth, where they competed for work as laborers and servants. They went to the colonies, as indentured servants bound for years of unpaid labor in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. And they went to sea. The Royal Navy of the early 18th century was, among other things, a machine for absorbing the human surplus of rural England. It took boys as young as 7 or 8, trained them in the brutal and technical craft of sailing and fighting, and used them until they were worn out or dead. The food was bad. The pay was worse. The discipline was savage. Flogging was routine, and execution by hanging was common for offenses that would merit a fine on land. But for a boy with no land, no trade, and no prospects, the Navy offered something: a place to be, a skill to learn, a path that led somewhere other than the village churchyard. Samuel Bellamy went to sea. We do not know exactly when or under what circumstances, but by the time the War of the Spanish Succession began in 1701, he was already a sailor, and he would spend the next 12 years learning his trade in the greatest naval conflict of the age. The War of the Spanish Succession was, at its heart, a fight over who would inherit the throne of Spain and, with it, the vast Spanish Empire in the Americas, the Philippines, and the Low Countries. When the last Habsburg king of Spain died childless in 1700, the great powers of Europe, England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic, went to war over the succession, and they stayed at war for 13 years. It was a global conflict, fought on land from Bavaria to Brazil and at sea from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean, and it reshaped the political map of Europe in ways that would endure for centuries. For the young men who fought it, the war was simply a brutal education in survival. A sailor in the English fleet of the early 1700s lived in conditions that would be considered unconscionable by any modern standard. He slept in a hammock slung between the guns, in a space so cramped that turning over required coordination with the men on either side. He ate salt pork and hardtack biscuit that was often so infested with weevils that experienced sailors learned to eat in the dark, preferring not to see what they were chewing. He drank weak beer when it was available and stagnant water when it was not. He worked watches of 4 hours on and 4 hours off, day and night, in all weathers, climbing the rigging in storms that made the masts whip like fishing rods and hauling on lines that could tear the skin from his palms. And he learned to fight. Naval gunnery in the age of sail was a skilled trade, requiring teams of men to work together with the precision of a factory floor, loading, ramming, running out, aiming, firing, swabbing, reloading, over and over in the deafening chaos of a gun deck filled with smoke and flame and the screams of the wounded. A well-drilled crew could fire 3 broadsides in 5 minutes. A poorly drilled crew could blow themselves up. Bellamy learned this trade, and he learned it well enough that he would eventually command the gunnery of 54 vessels. He also learned something else, something that the Navy taught without meaning to. He learned that the men who ran the ships and the men who owned them were not the same people, and that the distance between them was measured in every meal, every flogging, every death. The officers ate fresh meat when it was available. The common sailors ate salt. The officers had cabins with windows and furniture. The common sailors slept in the dark between the guns. The officers were gentlemen, or aspired to be. The common sailors were labor, human machinery, interchangeable and expendable, to be used until worn out and then replaced. The war ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. France's candidate took the Spanish throne, but Spain and France were forbidden to unite, and England gained Gibraltar, Minorca, and the Asiento, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to the Spanish colonies in the Americas. It was a settlement that reshaped the balance of power in Europe and laid the foundations for Britain's commercial empire. It was also a catastrophe for the men who had fought to achieve it. The Royal Navy, which had swelled to wartime strength, now had to shrink back to peacetime levels. Thousands of sailors were discharged, thrown onto the docks of English port cities with their back pay, if they were lucky, and nothing else. They had spent years, sometimes decades, learning skills that had no civilian application. They knew how to sail a ship of the line and how to fire a 32-pound cannon, but they did not know how to farm or keep shop or practice a trade. They were trained for a job that no longer existed in a labor market that was suddenly flooded with men exactly like them. The port cities of England in 1713 were full of discharged sailors. They slept in alleys and under bridges. They begged. They stole. They drank themselves to death when they could afford the drink. Some found berths on merchant ships, but the merchant marine was also contracting, and wages were falling as the supply of desperate sailors overwhelmed the demand. A man who had earned 30 shillings a month in the Navy might now compete for a berth that paid 20 or 15 or less, and the competition was fierce enough that ship owners could impose conditions that would have been unthinkable in wartime. Samuel Bellamy was one of these men. He was in his mid-20s, a veteran of more than a decade of naval service, possessed of skills that were suddenly worth almost nothing. He had no land, no trade, no family connections, no capital. He had nothing but his seamanship and his strength and whatever ambition still burned in him after years of hard use. What he did next would change his life. He went to America. The Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1715 was a world poised between wilderness and civilization, between the old Puritan theocracy and the commercial society that was rising to replace it. Boston was a city of perhaps 12,000 souls, the largest English settlement in North America, a forest of church steeples and ship masts crowded onto a narrow peninsula connected to the mainland by a single neck of land. The harbor was thick with shipping, coasters and fishing boats, merchantmen bound for the Caribbean and Europe, whalers fitting out for voyages that might last years. The wharves smelled of tar and saltfish and rum, and the taverns along the waterfront were full of sailors from every corner of the Atlantic world. Beyond Boston, the colony stretched in a ragged crescent along the coast, Salem and Marblehead to the north, Plymouth and Cape Cod to the south, with scattered settlements pushing inland along the rivers. The population was perhaps 90,000, mostly farmers and fishermen, mostly descendants of the Puritan immigrants who had arrived nearly a century before. They were a sober people, at least in their own telling, church-going, hard-working, suspicious of luxury and display. They were also increasingly a commercial people, connected by trade to a web of ports that stretched from London to West Africa to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. Cape Cod extended from this world like a crooked arm bent at the elbow, a 60-mile hook of sand and scrub pine that reached out into the Atlantic and then curled back toward the mainland. The outer cape, the forearm and fist of the arm, was a landscape of dunes and salt marshes, of cranberry bogs and cedar swamps, of fishing villages clinging to the shore and watching the sea. The towns bore English names that had been old before the colonists arrived: Eastham, Wellfleet, Truro, Provincetown, and the people who lived in them made their living from the ocean, fishing for cod and mackerel, salvaging wrecks, hunting the whales that sometimes stranded on the beaches. It was to this remote and windswept place that Samuel Bellamy came, sometime in 1715. We do not know exactly why. The most common explanation, the one that is passed into legend, is that he came as a treasure hunter, drawn by news of the Spanish plate fleet that had been wrecked off the coast of Florida in July of that year. But the legends also say something else. They say he came for love. Her name, according to the traditions of Cape Cod, was Maria Hallett. She was young, 15 or 16, depending on which version one believes, and she was beautiful, with dark hair and pale skin and eyes that the legends describe variously as blue or gray or green. She lived in Eastham, on the inner elbow of the Cape, in a house that looked out across the salt marshes toward the bay. Her family was respectable, but not wealthy. Farmers, perhaps, or perhaps connected to the fishing trade. The sources are silent on the details, and the details they do provide are contradictory. What the legends agree on is that Samuel Bellamy met Maria Hallett, and that he fell in love with her, and that this love would shape everything that followed. We cannot know if this is true. The story of Maria Hallett does not appear in any contemporary document. No court record, no church register, no newspaper account mentions her by name. She exists only in the folklore of Cape Cod, in stories that were passed down orally for generations before anyone thought to write them down. By the time collectors began recording these traditions in the 19th century, the story had acquired all the trappings of legend. Maria had become a witch or a madwoman or a ghost who walked the dunes forever waiting for her lost love. The historical Maria, if she existed at all, had been buried beneath layers of embellishment. And yet the story persists. It persists because it makes emotional sense of what happened next, because it transforms Bellamy's career from a simple tale of greed into something more complex, a story about a man trying to become worthy of the woman he loved. It persists because Cape Cod has a long memory, and because the people who live there have always believed it. And it persists because, when the wreck of the Whydah was finally excavated in the 1980s, the artifacts that came up from the seafloor included a small gold ring with a heart-shaped setting, exactly the sort of token a young man might give to a young woman as a pledge of love. We cannot prove that Maria Hallett existed. We cannot prove that she didn't. What we can say is that something drove Samuel Bellamy south in the autumn of 1715, and that whatever he was looking for, he did not find it by honest means. The 1715 plate fleet was one of the great disasters of Spanish colonial history. 11 ships had sailed from Havana in July of that year, loaded with the accumulated treasure of the Americas: silver from the mines of Potosi, gold from New Granada, emeralds and pearls, and indigo and cochineal. They were making for Spain, following the established route that took them north along the Florida coast to catch the Gulf Stream and then east across the Atlantic. It was a journey that had been made hundreds of times by hundreds of ships over more than 2 centuries of Spanish dominion. But the 1715 fleet sailed too late in the season, and on July 31st, a hurricane struck them off the coast of what is now Vero Beach. 10 of the 11 ships were driven ashore and wrecked. More than 1,000 people died: sailors and soldiers, merchants and priests, passengers returning to Spain after years in the colonies. The treasure scattered across miles of seafloor, and the surviving Spaniards established salvage camps along the coast to recover what they could. News of the disaster spread quickly. In port cities throughout the Caribbean and along the Atlantic seaboard, men began organizing expeditions to salvage the Spanish gold, some licensed by colonial governments, others operating in the gray zone between legitimate salvage and outright theft. The Florida coast became a boomtown of the sea, crowded with salvage vessels and the men who crewed them, all of them digging in the sand and diving in the shallows for the treasure of a dead empire. Samuel Bellamy joined one of these expeditions. We do not know the details: who led it, how many men were involved, what arrangements had been made for dividing any recovered treasure. What we do know is that the expedition failed. The Spanish had gotten there first, and what they hadn't recovered, the sea had scattered or buried beyond reach. Bellamy found nothing. He was broke, stranded in the Caribbean, thousands of miles from Cape Cod and the woman he had promised to return to as a wealthy man. It was at this moment, broke, desperate, his legitimate options exhausted, that Samuel Bellamy made the decision that would define his life. He decided to become a pirate. The piracy that flourished in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast in the early 18th century was not a random outbreak of lawlessness. It was the predictable result of specific historical circumstances, a perfect storm of unemployed sailors, weak colonial governance, and a maritime economy that ran on exploitation. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1713 had dumped thousands of trained sailors into a labor market that could not absorb them. At the same time, the colonial powers, England, France, Spain, were reducing their naval presence in American waters, leaving vast stretches of ocean essentially unpoliced. The legitimate maritime economy, meanwhile, was becoming harsher and more exploitative. Merchant captains, facing competition from the glut of available sailors, cut wages and increased workloads. Conditions aboard merchant ships, always bad, became worse. A sailor who had once earned 40 shillings a month might now earn 20 for longer voyages, under harsher discipline, with worse food. Against this background, piracy began to look less like crime and more like economic self-defense. A pirate ship was, in many ways, the inverse of a merchant ship or a naval vessel. Where legitimate ships were governed by harsh discipline imposed from above, pirate ships were governed by articles, written agreements that all crew members signed, specifying the division of plunder, the compensation for injuries, and the procedures for settling disputes. Where legitimate captains held their positions by appointment and exercised nearly unlimited authority, pirate captains were elected by their crews and could be deposed by vote. Where legitimate ships extracted labor from their crews and concentrated wealth in the hands of owners and officers, pirate ships distributed plunder according to shares, with the captain typically receiving only 1.5 or 2 shares compared to 1 share for each common crew member. This was not democracy in any modern sense. Pirate ships were violent places, and the men who sailed on them were capable of extraordinary cruelty. But they were also, in their rough way, more egalitarian than anything else afloat in the early 18th century. They offered something that the legitimate maritime world did not: a chance for a common sailor to share in the wealth he helped create. The center of this world, in 1715 and 1716, was New Providence in the Bahamas. New Providence was, in theory, an English colony, part of the proprietary grant that had created the Bahamas in the previous century. In practice, it was a pirate republic. The town of Nassau, such as it was, consisted of a few hundred ramshackle buildings clustered around a harbor that could shelter several hundred ships. The nominal governor had long since fled, and the actual governance of the island was conducted by whoever had the most guns and the most men. At any given time, the population included several thousand pirates, plus the merchants, prostitutes, tavern keepers, and fences who served them. It was to New Providence that Samuel Bellamy came, sometime in late 1715 or early 1716, and it was there that he began his transformation from desperate treasure hunter to pirate captain. The man who would become Bellamy's mentor was a veteran pirate named Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold was an Englishman, probably from Norfolk, who had been sailing out of New Providence for several years and had accumulated a reputation as both a skilled seaman and a man of principle. or at least of something resembling principle. He refused, as a matter of policy, to attack English ships, targeting only Spanish and French vessels, and he ran his crew with something approaching professional discipline. He was not a romantic figure. He was a pragmatist, a man who saw piracy as a business and conducted it accordingly. Bellamy joined Hornigold's crew, and for several months he sailed under Hornigold's command, learning the trade of piracy as he had once learned the trade of naval warfare. The work was similar in many ways, the same skills of seamanship and gunnery, the same rhythms of chase and capture, the same violence when violence was required. But the economics were different. Every man aboard a pirate ship had a stake in the outcome. Every man voted on major decisions. Every man was, in theory at least, an equal partner in the enterprise. Bellamy thrived in this environment. He was young, strong, intelligent, and possessed of a gift for leadership that had never had a chance to flower under the rigid hierarchies of the Royal Navy. He rose quickly through the informal ranks of Hornigold's crew, becoming first a trusted subordinate and then something more, a rival center of authority, a man around whom other men began to gather. The break, when it came, was over a question of policy. Hornigold's refusal to attack English ships had always been controversial. There were more English ships in these waters than any other kind, and refusing to target them meant passing up the majority of potential prizes. By early 1716, a faction of Hornigold's crew had had enough. They wanted a captain who would attack any ship, regardless of flag. The exact circumstances of what happened next are unclear. Some sources suggest that Hornigold was formally deposed by a vote of his crew. Others suggest that the crew simply split, with those who supported Hornigold going one way and those who wanted more aggressive leadership going another. What is certain is that by the spring of 1716, Samuel Bellamy was no longer sailing under Benjamin Hornigold's command. He was sailing under his own. He had been a pirate for less than a year. He was perhaps 26 or 27 years old. He had no ship of his own, only the loyalty of the men who had chosen to follow him and whatever vessels they could capture together. But he had made the crucial transition. He was no longer a follower. He was a captain. And over the next 12 months, he would become the most successful pirate who ever lived. The man who emerged as captain of this breakaway crew was different, in certain subtle ways, from the desperate treasure hunter who had arrived in the Caribbean months before. He had found his vocation, and it showed. The sources describe him as charismatic, eloquent, and unusually concerned with the welfare of his men. He wore his long, dark hair tied back with a black ribbon, hence the nickname Black Sam, disdaining the powdered wigs that were fashionable among gentlemen of the era. He dressed well when he could afford to, but without the ostentatious display that characterized some of his contemporaries. He was, by all accounts, physically impressive, tall and strong, with the weathered hands and easy movements of a man who had spent his life at sea. But what distinguished him most was his voice. Captain Charles Johnson, writing 7 years after Bellamy's death, would record what purport to be Bellamy's own words, speeches delivered to captured merchants and reluctant recruits, addresses that mixed philosophy with invective and self-justification with genuine radicalism. Even allowing for Johnson's embellishment, something comes through. A mind that thought about what it was doing, a man who had developed a coherent worldview to explain and justify his choices. The most famous of these speeches was allegedly delivered to a captured merchant captain who had refused to join Bellamy's crew. "I am sorry they won't let you have your sloop again," Bellamy supposedly said, "for I scorn to do anyone a mischief when it is not to my advantage." And then, warming to his subject, he continued, "Damn ye, you are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security. They vilify us, the scoundrels do. When there's only this difference, they rob the poor under the cover of law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Had you not better make one of us than sneak after these villains for employment?" The captain protested that his conscience would not allow it. "You are a devilish conscience rascal," Bellamy replied. "I am a free prince, and I have as much authority to make war on the whole world as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea and an army of 100,000 men in the field. And this, my conscience tells me. Whether Bellamy actually said these words, in this form, we cannot know. Johnson wrote from second-hand sources, and he had his own agendas. His book was popular entertainment as much as historical record. But the sentiment attributed to Bellamy was not unique to him. It echoed through the pirate communities of the early 18th century, appearing in articles, speeches, and the reported conversations of dozens of pirates who saw themselves not as criminals, but as rebels, men who had opted out of a corrupt system and created their own. This was the age of the pirate republic, the floating nation, the brotherhood of the coast. For a brief window, perhaps a decade, perhaps slightly more, piracy in the Atlantic world was not just crime. It was a counterculture with its own values, its own institutions, and its own sense of righteousness. Samuel Bellamy, sailing north from the Bahamas in the spring of 1716, was about to become its prince. The Caribbean of 1716 was a hunter's paradise. The war that had kept the navies of Europe occupied for more than a decade was over, and the warships that might have patrolled these waters had been recalled to home ports or laid up in Ordinary. The merchant fleets, meanwhile, were busier than ever. Sugar, rum, indigo, tobacco, slaves. The commodities of empire flowed through these waters in an endless procession, and the ships that carried them were fat and slow and largely undefended. For a man with a fast sloop and a willing crew, the opportunities were almost limitless. Bellamy understood this immediately. His first months as a captain were spent learning the rhythms of the Caribbean sea lanes, the patterns of trade that would tell him where ships would be and when. He learned that the windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola was a choke point through which much of the traffic from Jamaica had to pass. He learned that the waters around the Virgin Islands were thick with small traders moving goods between the minor islands. He learned that Spanish ships, still the richest prizes in these waters, sailed in convoys that were heavily guarded, while English and French merchants often traveled alone, trusting to luck and speed. He hunted carefully at first. The sloop he had inherited from his break with Hornigold was small, perhaps 60 feet long, with a crew of 90 men crowded into quarters that would have been cramped for 30. She was fast, which was essential, and she was weatherly, which meant she could sail closer to the wind than most of her prey. But she was lightly armed, carrying perhaps 8 or 10 small cannon, and she lacked the imposing presence that could persuade a merchant to surrender without a fight. Bellamy had to be smart about which ships he approached and how. The logic of piracy in this era was not primarily the logic of violence, it was the logic of calculation. A pirate captain approaching a potential prize was asking himself a series of questions. How many guns does she carry? How many men? Is she riding high in the water, suggesting her holds are empty, or low, suggesting a valuable cargo? Is she moving fast or wallowing? Does she look like she will fight, or does she look like she will run, or does she look like she will strike her colors at the first cannon shot? The goal, always, was to take the prize without damage to oneself. A battle meant repairs. Repairs meant delay. Delay meant exposure. And every day spent in one place increased the chance that a Royal Navy patrol would appear on the horizon. Bellamy proved to be exceptionally good at this calculus. In the early months of his independent command, he took ship after ship with minimal violence, relying on speed, surprise, and the reputation that was beginning to precede him. He learned to approach his targets at dawn or dusk, when the light was uncertain and his intentions unclear until it was too late. He learned to fly false colors, running up the flag of England or France until he was within cannon range, then raising the black flag that announced his true nature. He learned to fire a warning shot across the bow of a fleeing vessel, a gesture that told the prey that their pursuer was armed, serious, and willing to fight if necessary. But that fighting was not required if they would simply stop. Most of them stopped. The merchants and traders who sailed these waters were not soldiers. They were businessmen engaged in a commercial enterprise, men who had families and debts and futures to consider. When a pirate ship appeared, they ran the numbers just as the pirates did. What was the cargo worth? What were the chances of escape? What were the chances of successful resistance? And what was likely to happen if they fought and lost? The answers, more often than not, pointed toward surrender. The cargo belonged to the owners, not to the captain. The captain's life belonged to himself. Most captains chose their lives. This was the system that Bellamy mastered in the spring and summer of 1716. He swept through the waters around the Virgin Islands and along the shipping lanes of the Greater Antilles, taking prizes one after another. Small sloops carrying rum, schooners loaded with sugar, a brig carrying tobacco from Virginia, a snow with a hold full of indigo bound for London. Each prize was stripped of valuables, the cargo divided among the crew according to the ship's articles, and the vessel itself either sunk, burned, or released depending on its value and the pirates' needs. A few of the best ships were kept, adding to the small flotilla that now sailed under Bellamy's loose command. The crew grew with each prize. Pirate vessels were perpetually short of men. The attrition of disease, accident, desertion, and the occasional battle took a constant toll, and most pirate captains actively recruited from among the sailors of captured ships. Some of these sailors needed no persuading. They were already poorly paid, poorly fed, and poorly treated, and the pirate life offered them something better: a share of the profits rather than a pittance of wages, a vote in the ship's decisions rather than the absolute authority of a merchant captain, and the chance, however slim, of actually getting rich. Others were more reluctant, and here the pirates employed a mixture of persuasion, pressure, and selective coercion. Skilled men, carpenters, surgeons, navigators, were sometimes forced to join whether they wished to or not, their skills too valuable to leave behind. But most of those who joined did so voluntarily, or at least voluntarily enough that they could later claim, if captured, that they had been forced. Bellamy's crew was notably diverse, even by the standards of pirate vessels, which were among the most integrated environments in the Atlantic world. The records that survive, fragmentary, partial, filtered through the biases of the colonial courts that would later try the captured pirates, suggest a crew that included Englishmen, Welshmen, Scotsmen, Irishmen, colonials from Massachusetts and New York and Virginia, Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Spaniards, Native Americans from the mainland and the islands, and a significant number of Africans, some of whom had been enslaved and some of whom were free men who had made their own way to the outlaw ships. On the Whydah, when she finally went down, there may have been as many as 30 men of African descent among the crew of 145, a proportion that would have been unthinkable on a merchant vessel or a naval ship of the era. This diversity was not incidental to pirate culture. It was, in a sense, the point. The pirate ship was imagined by its inhabitants as a world apart, a floating republic that had severed its ties to the land-based systems of hierarchy and exclusion. The articles that governed these ships, the contracts that each man signed or marked when he joined, typically guaranteed equal shares of all prizes, equal votes in all decisions, and compensation for injuries sustained in the ship's service. They established, on paper and often in practice, a rough equality that was utterly foreign to the societies from which these men had come. A former slave and the son of an English gentleman stood on the same deck, drew from the same pot, voted in the same councils. Whether this equality was genuine or merely relative, whether it extended to all aspects of life aboard ship or merely to the formal provisions of the articles, the pirates themselves believed in it, and they contrasted it explicitly with the world they had left behind. This was the context for speeches like the one attributed to Bellamy. When he told the merchant captain that they rob the poor under the cover of law while we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage, he was articulating a worldview that circulated widely in the pirate communities of his era. The pirates saw themselves as men who had been wronged by a corrupt system and who had responded by creating their own, better alternative. They were not criminals. They were revolutionaries. They were free men. How sincerely they believed this and how consistently they lived it is difficult to say. The sources are written by their enemies. The pirates themselves left almost no documents. What we have are the records of trials, the accounts of victims, the memoirs of governors and naval officers, and the single most influential text on early 18th century piracy, Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724. Johnson may have been Daniel Defoe writing under a pseudonym. He may have been a retired sailor or a London hack or a composite of several authors. We do not know. What we know is that his book shaped everything that came after it, providing the template through which all subsequent generations have understood the golden age of piracy. When we think of pirates as romantic rebels, as democratic outlaws, as men who lived outside the law but according to a code, we are thinking in terms that Johnson established. Samuel Bellamy appears in Johnson's pages as a man of unusual intelligence and eloquence, a captain who led by persuasion rather than terror, who treated his prisoners with surprising decency, and who genuinely believed in the justice of his cause. How much of this is true, and how much is literary construction, we cannot say. But the Bellamy who emerges from the other sources, the court records, the depositions of captured sailors, the letters of colonial officials, is broadly consistent with Johnson's portrait. He was, by the standards of his profession, relatively restrained. He preferred negotiation to violence. He treated captives better than many of his contemporaries did. And he was successful, spectacularly successful, in ways that suggest genuine skill and not merely luck. By the autumn of 1716, barely 6 months after his break with Hornigold, Bellamy had captured more than a dozen vessels and accumulated a substantial fortune. He had attracted a crew of well over 100 men, distributed across several ships sailing in loose formation. He had established a reputation that preceded him, a name that merchant captains heard in port and worried about at sea. He was not yet the most famous pirate in the Caribbean. That honor still belonged to men like Edward Teach, who would soon become known as Blackbeard, and Charles Vane, whose cruelty was already legendary. But he was rising fast, and he was doing so in a way that would have pleased the romantic imagination, not as a bloodthirsty terror, but as something like a gentleman, a prince of pirates who took what he wanted without unnecessary brutality. The opportunity that would transform him from a successful pirate into a legendary one came in November of 1716. Bellamy was cruising off the coast of Hispaniola when his lookout spotted a sail to the east. The ship was a large merchantman, deep in the water, moving slowly under reduced canvas. She was clearly richly laden. She was also clearly capable of putting up a fight. Bellamy could see the gun ports along her hull, count the men moving on her decks. But she was alone, without the convoy that might have protected her, and she was moving into waters that Bellamy knew better than her captain did. He ordered pursuit. For 2 days, the chase continued across the Caribbean, Bellamy's faster sloop slowly closing the distance as the merchantman's captain tried every trick he knew to escape. He threw cargo overboard to lighten his ship. He altered course repeatedly, hoping to slip away in the darkness. He pushed his crew to exhaustion, keeping them working through the night watches to adjust the sails, to coax every knot of speed from his vessel. It was not enough. On the morning of the 3rd day, Bellamy drew alongside and fired a broadside into the merchantman's rigging. The ship was the Sultana, a galley out of London carrying a cargo of wine, provisions, and manufactured goods worth a substantial sum. Her captain was a man named Richest, and he had no intention of dying for his owner's property. When the black flag went up on Bellamy's mast, Richard struck his colors and waited for the pirates to board. The Sultana was a better ship than anything Bellamy currently possessed. She was larger, faster, more heavily armed, more comfortable. She could carry more men and more supplies, could range farther without resupply, could intimidate prizes that might have resisted a smaller vessel. Bellamy made her his new flagship and transferred his crew aboard. The old sloop was given to one of his subordinates, a capable sailor named Paul Williams, who would remain Bellamy's most trusted lieutenant for the remainder of his career. From the Sultana's deck, Bellamy now commanded a small fleet. His flagship, Williams's sloop, and 1 or 2 other vessels taken as prizes and manned with crews from among the volunteers and pressed men who had swelled his ranks. Together, they ranged across the Caribbean through the winter of 1716 and into early 1717, taking prize after prize in a campaign that began to attract the alarmed attention of colonial authorities throughout the region. The governor of Jamaica wrote to London requesting additional naval forces. The governor of the Bahamas, such as he was, for the Bahamas were barely governed at all in this period, complained that the pirates were becoming ungovernable. Merchants in London and Bristol and Liverpool pressed their representatives for action. Something would have to be done about the pirates. But for now, nothing was done, and Bellamy made the most of the interval. In February of 1717, still cruising in the Caribbean, his lookout spotted another sail, this one coming from the east, from the direction of Africa. The ship was called the Whydah Galley. She was named for the West African port of Whydah in the modern-day nation of Benin, one of the major embarkation points for the transatlantic slave trade. She was what the 18th century called a Guinea man, a ship built and outfitted specifically for the triangle trade, carrying manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, slaves from Africa to the Americas, and sugar, rum, and specie from the Americas back to Europe. She had been built just 2 years earlier in London for the merchant Lawrence Prince, and she was among the finest vessels of her type afloat. Three-masted, perhaps 300 tons, she was fast for a ship her size and extraordinarily well constructed. She had just completed the middle passage from Africa to Jamaica, where she had sold her human cargo, more than 300 enslaved Africans who had survived the crossing. And she was now returning to England with the proceeds of that sale in her hold. Those proceeds were substantial. In addition to sugar and indigo and other Caribbean commodities, the Whydah carried gold, silver, and jewelry, the currency in which slave merchants were often paid. Later estimates, reconstructed from insurance records and cargo manifests, suggested that the Whydah was carrying somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 pounds, sterling in specie and valuables. In an age when a skilled laborer might earn 20 pounds per year, this was an almost inconceivable sum. It was, by a considerable margin, the richest prize Samuel Bellamy had ever seen. The chase lasted 3 days. The Whydah's captain, Lawrence Prince himself, understood immediately what was happening when he saw the pirate flotilla emerge from behind a headland and swing toward his ship. He cracked on all sail and ran. For 72 hours, the pursuit continued, Prince pushing his ship to her limits while Bellamy's smaller, faster vessels slowly closed the distance. There was no escape. The arithmetic of the chase was inexorable. And when Bellamy finally drew alongside and his men swarmed over the gunwales, Prince did not resist. He was a businessman. The gold in his hold was not his gold. His life was his own. The transfer of command took place somewhere in the Windward Passage. Bellamy went aboard the Whydah, inspected her from stem to stern, and recognized immediately that he had captured something extraordinary. This was not merely a rich prize. This was a ship that could make him the most powerful pirate in the Atlantic. She was large enough to carry a crew of nearly 200. She was fast enough to overtake almost anything afloat. She was new, her timbers sound, her rigging in excellent condition. And she was already armed, though Bellamy would add to her guns in the coming weeks, bringing her complement up to 28 cannon, enough firepower to challenge anything short of a warship. He made her his flagship. The Sultana was given to Paul Williams. Captain Prince was set adrift in a small boat with his crew and a quantity of supplies, and made his way eventually to Jamaica, where he filed the insurance claim and deposition that would provide historians with their most detailed account of the Whydah's capture. The pirates divided the spoils according to their articles, each man receiving his share of the gold and silver and trade goods that had made this voyage the most successful of Bellamy's career. And then Samuel Bellamy did something unexpected. He turned north. The conventional pattern for Caribbean pirates was to cruise the warm waters of the West Indies during the winter months, then sail to the Bahamas or some other friendly port to careen their ships, sell their prizes, and wait out the hurricane season. The Atlantic coast of North America was rarely visited before summer, when the weather moderated and the coastal shipping that served the northern colonies reached its peak. But Bellamy, in the spring of 1717, broke with convention. As soon as the Whydah was under his command, he set a course for the north. The reasons can only be inferred. Bellamy left no journal, no letters, no account of his thinking. But several factors may have influenced his decision. The Caribbean, after his extraordinary run of success, was becoming dangerous. Word of the Whydah's capture would spread quickly. The royal governors would increase their patrols. The Navy might finally dispatch the warships that colonial merchants had been demanding for years. The safest course was to disappear for a while, to hunt in waters where no one expected him, to let the immediate alarm subside. There was also the question of where to dispose of his prize. The Bahamas, the traditional pirate haven, was increasingly compromised. There were rumors, accurate rumors as it turned out, that the Crown was preparing to send a new governor to clean up Nassau and suppress the pirate republic that had flourished there. Madagascar, on the far side of the world, was still available to those who wished to disappear entirely, but the voyage was long and dangerous. The North American coast offered something else, a series of ports and harbors, some of them nearly ungoverned, where a pirate with gold in his pockets might find merchants willing to trade, no questions asked. And then there was Maria Hallett. The legend says that Bellamy turned north because he was sailing home to the woman he loved, returning to Cape Cod with the fortune he had promised to make. The legend says that everything he had done in the Caribbean, every ship captured, every prize taken, every risk accepted, had been for her. That he was coming back to Eastham to claim the girl who had been forbidden to him when he was poor, who would now receive him as the wealthy man he had become. Whether this is true, we cannot know. The legend of Maria Hallett is Cape Cod folklore, passed down through oral tradition for generations before it was ever written down. There is no mention of her in any contemporary document, no record of a Maria Hallett in the Eastham church registers of the period, no verifiable evidence that Samuel Bellamy ever knew such a woman, or that he had any particular reason to sail to Cape Cod rather than anywhere else along the coast. But the legend persists, and legends persist for reasons. Perhaps there was a woman in Eastham. Perhaps Bellamy had told his crew about her during the long nights at sea. Perhaps he had promised her something, or promised himself something, and perhaps his decision to sail north in April of 1717 was driven at least in part by a desire to keep that promise. What we know for certain is that in early April of 1717, the Whydah galley, flagship of the pirate Prince Samuel Bellamy, entered the cold waters of the Atlantic north of the Caribbean, accompanied by Paul Williams's sloop and one or two smaller vessels. She was carrying somewhere between 4 and 5 tons of gold and silver. She was manned by a crew of nearly 150 men from a dozen different countries and backgrounds. She was the most powerful pirate ship in the western Atlantic, and she was sailing toward a storm. The weather that spring had been unsettled. The Atlantic coast of North America in early April is a liminal zone, caught between the dying grip of winter and the uncertain promise of warmer months ahead. Cold air masses still sweep down from Canada, meeting the warmer, moister air that flows northward from the Gulf Stream. And where these fronts collide, the atmosphere becomes unstable, breeding storms of exceptional violence. Sailors who had spent years in Caribbean waters where the weather patterns were more predictable, where the hurricane season announced itself and then departed on a reliable schedule, often found the North Atlantic in spring to be a different and more treacherous ocean entirely. The storms came without warning. The temperature could drop 30 degrees in an hour. The fog could descend so thick that a man could not see the bow of his own ship from the quarterdeck. And the nor'easters, those massive cyclonic storms that spiraled up the coast with counterclockwise fury, could generate waves and winds that rivaled anything the tropics produced, but with the added menace of water so cold that a man thrown overboard would be dead from hypothermia before he could drown. Bellamy and his crew, most of them Caribbean hands, would have had limited experience with these conditions. They had spent the past year in warmer waters, where even the most violent squalls were survivable if a ship could keep her bow into the wind and ride out the worst of it. The Whydah was a strong ship, well built, with a hull designed to withstand the Atlantic crossing, but she was also heavily laden. The treasure in her holds added weight that would affect her handling in heavy seas. The additional guns that Bellamy had mounted made her top-heavy. The modifications that had transformed her from a slaver into a warship had changed her balance in ways that would only become apparent when she was tested by conditions her builders had never anticipated. They made their way north through April, capturing prizes as they went. The pickings along the southern coast were lean. It was still early in the shipping season, but Bellamy was not primarily hunting. He was moving. Each day, the Whydah and her consorts crept further up the coast, past the Carolinas, past Virginia, past the Chesapeake, into the colder waters where the spring trade was just beginning to stir. They took a few small vessels. They released most of them after stripping them of whatever valuables and useful supplies they carried. The crew was in high spirits. They were rich beyond any reasonable expectation. The hardest work was behind them. All that remained was to find a safe harbor, divide the plunder according to the articles, and decide what came next. On the night of April 26, 1717, the Whydah was approximately half a mile off the coast of Wellfleet on the outer arm of Cape Cod. The Cape itself is one of the more distinctive geographical features of the North American coastline, a long, curving peninsula that extends some 65 miles into the Atlantic, shaped roughly like a flexed arm with its fist clenched at Provincetown. The outer shore, facing the open ocean, is a continuous beach of sand and low dunes, beautiful but treacherous, with shoals and sandbars extending far out into the water, invisible beneath the surface, waiting for any ship that strayed too close in poor visibility. For centuries, this stretch of coast would be known as one of the most dangerous on the Atlantic seaboard. Hundreds of ships would wreck here over the years. The men who lived in the Cape Cod towns became expert salvagers, supplementing their incomes by recovering cargo and materials from vessels that came to grief on the outer beach. Some darker traditions suggest they were not always passive in this, that on stormy nights, lanterns might be placed on the dunes to lure ships onto the shoals, where they could be plundered once the sea had done its work. Whether these stories are true or merely the inevitable folklore that accumulates around any community that profits from disaster, the Outer Cape was and remains a graveyard of ships. The storm that struck on the night of April 26 was a classic nor'easter, though its arrival seems to have caught Bellamy by surprise. The weather had been deteriorating throughout the day, the barometric pressure dropping, the wind shifting to the northeast. But these warning signs were perhaps less legible to a crew that had spent so little time in these waters. By nightfall, the storm had intensified into something monstrous. Winds that may have reached 70 miles per hour were driving rain and spray horizontally across the decks. The waves had built to heights of 20 or 30 feet, their crests torn off by the wind and flung as stinging sheets of foam. Visibility was essentially zero. The Whydah, struggling to keep sea room, found herself being driven inexorably toward the coast. The details of what happened in those final hours can only be reconstructed from fragments. 2 men survived the wreck, a Mosquito Indian from Central America named John Julian, and a crewman from Wales named Thomas Davis, and their subsequent testimony provides the only eyewitness account. But both men were below decks when the ship struck, and their knowledge of events on the weather deck was limited to what they could infer from the sounds and sensations of a ship in extremity. What seems clear is that the Whydah, despite the best efforts of her helmsman, lost her battle with the storm. She was driven onto a sandbar approximately 500 feet from shore, close enough that a man might have waded to safety in calm water, but in the conditions of that night, an impassable distance. The impact when she struck would have been violent, the sudden stop throwing men from their feet, snapping the rigging taut, straining every joint and timber in the hull. What happened next was worse. A ship grounded on a sandbar in heavy surf is caught in a kind of mechanical hell. Each wave that passes beneath her lifts her slightly and then drops her back onto the sand, pounding her hull against the bottom with tremendous force. The sand itself acts as an abrasive, grinding through the planking. The waves break over the deck, filling the vessel with water that has no way to escape. The masts, subjected to forces they were never designed to withstand, begin to work loose in their steps, opening seams in the deck. In a nor'easter of the intensity that struck on April 26th, this process would have unfolded with terrifying speed. The Whydah's masts went first, snapping under the combined force of wind and wave, crashing down onto the deck in a tangle of rigging and shattered timber. The hull began to break apart. The treasure that had been stowed below, the gold and silver, the ivory and indigo, the accumulated fortune of a year's piracy, began to spill out through the opening wounds in the ship's belly, sinking into the sand and water below. The crew had no chance. 143 men drowned that night, either trapped below as the ship came apart or thrown into the surf when the deck broke beneath them. The water temperature would have been in the mid-40s Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an average man within 15 minutes, even if he could keep his head above the waves. In the chaos of the wreck, with debris churning through the water, with the waves breaking continuously over submerged heads, with the shore tantalizingly close but utterly unreachable. Even the strongest swimmers would have succumbed within minutes. Bodies would wash ashore for days afterward, bloated and battered, stripped of whatever valuables they had been carrying by the same churning action that had killed them. John Julian and Thomas Davis survived through what can only be called blind luck. Julian, the mosquito, would have had exceptional swimming abilities. His people were renowned as divers and fishermen, but even so, his survival was improbable. Davis claimed afterward that he was asleep when the ship struck and barely escaped the flooding hold. Both men made it to shore, half drowned and hypothermic, and were immediately taken into custody by the colonists who gathered on the beach to survey the disaster. Samuel Bellamy was not among the survivors. His body was never positively identified, though tradition holds that one of the corpses recovered from the beach was his, distinguished by the long black hair that had given him his sobriquet. Whether this identification was accurate or merely wishful thinking on the part of storytellers who wanted a body to bury, we cannot know. What is certain is that at 28 years old, after barely more than a year as a pirate captain, the man who had captured more ships and accumulated more treasure than any pirate before or since was dead. His fortunes scattered across the seafloor, his crew drowned or dying in the surf, his flagship reduced to driftwood and debris washing up on the sands of Cape Cod. The colonial authorities wasted no time. Within hours of the wreck, the governor of Massachusetts, Samuel Shute, had dispatched officials to secure the site and recover whatever treasure could be salvaged. The early efforts were remarkably successful. Divers working in the days immediately after the storm recovered significant quantities of gold and silver, much of which was eventually returned to the colonial treasury. The survivors, Julian and Davis, were imprisoned and eventually brought to trial. Davis claimed, with some plausibility, that he had been a forced man, a carpenter pressed into service against his will and never permitted to leave. He was acquitted. Julian's fate is less clear. The historical record loses track of him after the trial, though some accounts suggest he was sold into slavery, an ironic end for a man who had served on a pirate crew whose articles explicitly prohibited the taking of slaves. The wreck itself quickly vanished beneath the sands. The outer beaches of Cape Cod are not stable. They shift constantly, shaped by the same storms that destroyed the ships unfortunate enough to approach them. The Whydah, broken and scattered, was buried within years, her location becoming uncertain even to the men who had seen her struck. Within a generation, she had passed from living memory into local legend. The story of the pirate ship wrecked off Wellfleet in 1717 persisted in Cape Cod folklore, but the exact site of the wreck was lost. For nearly 3 centuries she lay beneath the sand, her treasure and her secrets intact, while above her the world forgot. The aftermath of the Whydah disaster rippled through the Atlantic world in ways both immediate and long-lasting. In Massachusetts, the wreck was front-page news, confirmation of the pirate threat that colonial officials had been warning about for years. The subsequent trial of the survivors was a public spectacle, drawing crowds to the courtroom in Boston where prosecutors presented evidence of the pirates' crimes, and defense attorneys argued, with varying degrees of success, that their clients had been unwilling participants in Bellamy's depredations. The trial also produced some of the most detailed contemporary accounts of life aboard a pirate ship. As witnesses testified about the articles, the divisions of plunder, the treatment of prisoners, the daily routines of men who lived entirely outside the law. These records, preserved in the colonial archives, would become invaluable to historians seeking to understand the reality of Golden Age piracy beneath the layers of myth and romance. In the Caribbean, the news of Bellamy's death was received with a mixture of relief and apprehension. One of the most successful pirates of the era was gone, but his success had demonstrated that the profits of piracy were still enormous enough to tempt desperate men. The royal officials who had been promising for years to suppress the pirate menace now had fresh evidence of both the problem and its scale. The Whydah's treasure, or what remained of it, testified to the fortunes that were being extracted from legitimate commerce by armed robbery. Within a year, Woodes Rogers would arrive in the Bahamas as the new royal governor, carrying with him a proclamation of amnesty for any pirate who surrendered and a mandate to hunt down those who did not. The crackdown that followed would effectively end the golden age of Caribbean piracy, scattering the remaining pirates to Madagascar, to the West African coast, to the Indian Ocean, to anywhere that remained beyond the reach of the Royal Navy. Bellamy did not live to see this, but his death was part of its beginning. One more piece of evidence that the pirate republic could not sustain itself, that the forces of empire would eventually prevail. For the men who had survived Bellamy's crew in other ways, those who had been aboard prize ships he captured, those who had been forced to join and then escaped or been released, those who had heard his speeches and remembered them, the legacy was more personal. Bellamy's eloquence had made an impression. His denunciations of the merchant class, his insistence that the pirates were no worse than the legitimate powers that condemned them, his declaration that he and his men were free princes who answered to no king. These words were repeated and embroidered in the years that followed, becoming part of the mythology of piracy itself. When later writers sought to romanticize the pirates of the early 18th century, to present them as proto-democrats or social revolutionaries or noble rebels against an unjust system, they drew heavily on the reported speeches of Samuel Bellamy, whose rhetoric seemed to validate exactly this interpretation. Whether Bellamy himself believed what he said, whether he was a genuine ideologue or simply a skilled leader who understood the power of words to motivate his crew, is impossible to determine. The effect was the same. He became, posthumously, the poet laureate of piracy. And then there was Maria Hallett. The legend of Maria Hallett is one of the most enduring pieces of Cape Cod folklore, passed down through generations of storytelling before it was ever committed to paper. According to the traditional account, Maria was a young woman of Eastham. Some versions say the daughter of a respectable family. Others say a common girl of no particular standing, who fell in love with the handsome young sailor Samuel Bellamy during his brief stay on the Cape around 1715. Bellamy, poor and without prospects, could not marry her, but he promised to return once he had made his fortune. He sailed south to seek treasure from the wrecked Spanish fleet. When the salvage expedition failed, he turned pirate, and everything he did thereafter was in service of his promise to return to Maria as a wealthy man. The legend says that Maria waited, that she walked the dunes of Wellfleet in all weathers, watching the horizon for the ship that would bring her lover home. That when the Whydah wrecked on the night of April 26th, she was there on the beach, watching, and that she heard Bellamy's voice crying out to her through the storm before he drowned. That afterward, driven mad by grief or by guilt or by the supernatural forces that were said to attend any woman who waited too long for a man who never came, she became known as the Witch of Wellfleet, a solitary and fearsome figure who haunted the outer beaches for the rest of her life, sometimes said to lure ships onto the shoals with false lights, sometimes said to walk alongside drowning sailors as they died, sometimes said to wail her lost lover's name into the wind on stormy nights. The variants of the legend are numerous and contradictory. In some versions, Maria bore Bellamy's child before he left, and the child died, and her grief for both of them drove her to madness. In some versions, she was prosecuted by the Puritan authorities for bearing a bastard and forced to do public penance. In some versions, she lived to a great age, still walking the beaches in her old age, still watching, still waiting. In some versions, her ghost continues to walk them still. What is true in all this? Almost certainly less than the legend claims. There is no contemporary documentation of a Maria Hallett in Eastham during the period in question. The church records, which were meticulous about births, deaths, marriages, and public penances, contain no mention of her. The earliest written accounts of the legend date from well over a century after Bellamy's death, long after any living memory of the events could be verified. The story has all the hallmarks of folklore: the beautiful young woman, the dashing lover, the tragic promise, the supernatural aftermath. It may have no historical basis whatsoever. And yet, the legend persists because it answers a need. The wreck of the Whydah was a public disaster, witnessed by hundreds of Cape Cod residents, producing bodies and debris and treasure that washed ashore for weeks. It demanded explanation, it demanded meaning, and the simplest meaning, that a pirate ship was caught in a storm and sank, was somehow insufficient. The human mind rebels against randomness, especially when the randomness is cruel. There had to be a reason Bellamy was sailing for Cape Cod. There had to be a reason he came so close to shore. There had to be a human story behind the catastrophe, a story of love and loss and promise unkept, something that could redeem the senseless death of 143 men by giving it the shape of tragedy rather than mere accident. Whether Maria Hallett existed or not, she serves this function perfectly. She is the witness, the waiter, the embodiment of loss. She transforms the wreck of the Whydah from a maritime disaster into a love story. And love stories are how we remember things that would otherwise be too painful to hold in memory. Perhaps she was real, and the legend simply grew around her. Perhaps she was invented, whole cloth, to fill a narrative need. Perhaps, and this is the interpretation that captures something true even if no fact supports it, there was a woman in Eastham who had known Samuel Bellamy, who had cared for him, who had expected him back, and whose name was simply forgotten while the shape of her story was preserved. The details do not survive. The pattern does. What we can say with greater confidence is that Bellamy did exist, that he was real, that he lived and fought and plundered and died in verifiable ways that leave traces in the historical record. The Whydah was real. Her wreck was documented by colonial officials. Her survivors were tried in Boston. Her treasure was partially recovered. These things happened. They are not legend. And for nearly 3 centuries, that was all that remained. The documentary evidence of a famous shipwreck, the folklore that accumulated around it, and the slow burial of the ship herself beneath the shifting sands of Cape Cod. The sands of the outer Cape are not a permanent grave. What the sea takes, the sea occasionally returns. The same currents that bury wrecks can also expose them, peeling back layers of sediment to reveal what lies beneath. Storms that destroy ships in one generation can uncover them for another generation to find. The outer beach is in constant motion, a fluid landscape that only looks stable to those who do not watch it closely. Beneath that surface, the Whydah lay waiting. In the early 1980s, an underwater explorer and salvage operator named Barry Clifford became obsessed with finding her. Clifford was a Cape Cod native, raised on the local legends, familiar with the stories of the pirate ship and her lost treasure. He had spent years researching the wreck, combing through historical records, studying nautical charts, interviewing local fishermen who had noticed debris in certain areas, analyzing the patterns of current and sediment that might indicate where a 300-year-old shipwreck might be found. Most experts were skeptical. The outer Cape had been surveyed repeatedly. Modern technology had found nothing. The wreck, if anything remained of it, was probably too deeply buried, too dispersed, too fragmentary to locate. Clifford was not deterred. In the summer of 1984, working with a team of divers and using magnetometer readings to detect anomalies beneath the sand, Clifford found what he was looking for. The first object recovered was a cannon, heavily encrusted with centuries of marine growth, but unmistakably 18th century in design. More objects followed in the days and weeks after, coins, both gold and silver, scattered across the seafloor like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Pewter plates, navigation instruments, the detritus of a ship and the lives it had carried. But the discovery that would prove everything, the artifact that would transform this from a promising find into a verified historical treasure, came when divers located a bell buried in the sand. When they brought it to the surface and cleaned away the concretion of 3 centuries, the inscription was still legible. The Whydah Galley, 1716. It was the only pirate shipwreck ever conclusively identified. In the long history of maritime archaeology, in all the decades of searching for the ships of Blackbeard and Kidd and Morgan and the countless other captains whose names had passed into legend, no one had ever found a pirate vessel with proof positive of her identity. Here was proof. Here was the ship herself, or what remained of her. Her bones scattered across a debris field that would ultimately span more than 4 football fields of ocean floor. Here was the physical evidence of a career that had lasted barely a year and ended in the space of a single night. The excavation of the Whydah site would become one of the most significant archaeological projects in maritime history, spanning decades and continuing to this day. What Clifford and his team found beneath the sands of Cape Cod was not a ship in any conventional sense, not a hull you could photograph, not a structure you could map and measure and reconstruct. The violence of the storm and the weight of 3 centuries had seen to that. What they found instead was a debris field, a vast underwater graveyard of objects torn from the ship and scattered across the seafloor, buried and reburied by the endless motion of sand and current. The process of excavation was painstaking, methodical, and often frustrating. Divers worked in near-zero visibility, feeling their way through clouds of suspended sediment, using water jets to carefully remove layers of sand from promising areas while trying not to damage fragile artifacts beneath. Each object recovered had to be plotted, photographed, and cataloged before being brought to the surface. Once above water, years of conservation work were required to stabilize materials that had spent centuries in a saltwater environment. Wood, leather, and organic materials were particularly challenging. The same conditions that preserved metal could utterly destroy more fragile substances, leaving gaps in the record that no amount of careful excavation could fill. And yet, despite these challenges, the sheer volume of material recovered from the Whydah site has been staggering. As of the most recent counts, more than 200,000 individual artifacts have been brought up from the wreck. The treasure alone, the gold and silver that Bellamy and his crew had accumulated in their year of plundering, amounted to tens of thousands of coins, ranging from Spanish pieces of 8 to West African gold dust, from Portuguese cruzados to English shillings. The total value, while impossible to calculate precisely, runs into the tens of millions of dollars in modern terms, and the full extent of the treasure field may not yet have been mapped. More coins are found with each new diving season. The sands continue to give up their dead. But the treasure, spectacular as it is, represents only a fraction of the site's historical value. What makes the Whydah excavation genuinely significant is not the gold, but the glimpse it provides into the daily lives of working pirates in the early 18th century. Lives that, until this discovery, were known almost entirely through documents written by their enemies. The colonial records tell us how pirates were prosecuted, how they were executed, how respectable society viewed them and feared them and eventually destroyed them. What they do not tell us is how pirates lived, what they ate, what they wore, what objects they carried, how they passed their days between captures. The Whydah site fills these gaps with physical evidence that no written record could provide. Consider the personal effects. Among the artifacts recovered are hundreds of objects that once belonged to individual men aboard the ship, men whose names are mostly lost, whose faces we will never see, whose voices went silent in the roar of that April storm. They left behind buttons from coats and waistcoats, some plain and some decorated, suggesting the range of dress aboard the vessel from common sailors to men who had acquired finer clothes through plunder or prize. They left behind buckles for shoes and belts, their designs reflecting the fashion of their era. They left behind smoking pipes, dozens of them, clay bowls blackened by use, the universal comfort of 18th century maritime life. They left behind cufflinks and rings, small personal adornments that hint at individual vanity even among men who had abandoned every other convention of respectable society. The weapons tell their own story. Cannons, of course. The Whydah carried 28 guns when she went down, and many of these have been recovered, their iron barrels now fused with the marine growth of centuries. But also smaller arms, pistols, muskets, cutlasses, boarding axes, the tools of close combat that transformed these vessels from sailing ships into floating arsenals. The variety is remarkable. Pistols of French manufacture lie beside English muskets and Spanish blades, a jumbled armory accumulated through capture and trade and theft, standardized by nothing except effectiveness. These men took what worked, they used what killed. The navigational instruments speak to the technical competence required for this way of life. Compasses have been recovered, their brass cases still intact after 3 centuries. dividers for measuring distances on charts, sand glasses for marking time, lead-sounding weights for measuring depth in unfamiliar waters. These were not ignorant men flailing across unknown seas. They were skilled navigators, trained in the Royal Navy or the Merchant Service, applying their expertise to illicit ends. The same knowledge that could guide a cargo ship safely into port could guide a pirate vessel to intercept her. The difference was not in the knowing, but in the purpose. And then there are the objects that confound simple categorization, that resist easy interpretation, that remind us how much we do not and cannot know about the men who owned them. A small gold ring, sized for a finger smaller than a grown man's, a woman's ring, or a child's, carried perhaps as a keepsake or taken as plunder from some unknown victim. A teardrop-shaped gold nugget, clearly African in origin, likely from the Gold Coast where the Whydah had traded before her capture. Fragments of silk fabric, preserved by some miracle of chemistry in the oxygen-poor sediment, their original colors faded to ghosts of what they once were. Each of these objects was owned by someone, held by someone, valued by someone who died on the night of April 26, 1717. Each represents a life that ended on those sands. Each asks questions that cannot be answered. The site has also yielded evidence of the Whydah's most troubling cargo: human beings. Before Bellamy captured her, the Whydah was a slave ship, fresh from the African coast, and the evidence of this trade is unmistakable in the archaeological record. Shackles have been recovered from the debris field, iron restraints designed to immobilize human bodies during the Middle Passage, glass trade beads, the currency used to purchase enslaved people on the African coast, cowrie shells used as money in West Africa, found by the thousands scattered across the site. These objects force a reckoning with the full complexity of the Whydah's history, and by extension, with Bellamy's legacy. The ship he made his flagship, the vessel he called his own, was built and designed for the transportation of enslaved Africans. The wealth in her holds when he captured her was wealth accumulated through the slave trade. Whatever Bellamy said about liberty and freedom, and the surviving accounts suggest he said quite a lot, he built his fortune on a ship whose primary purpose was human bondage. This is not a paradox that can be easily resolved. Bellamy's crew, by all surviving accounts, included a substantial number of black sailors, men of African descent who served alongside their white counterparts, shared in the prizes, voted in the councils, and were apparently treated with something approaching equality in the floating democracy of the pirate ship. The two survivors of the Whydah wreck included a man named John Julian, described in the colonial records as a Cape Cod Indian, or in other accounts as a man of African or mixed ancestry. The sources are unclear and probably themselves confused about the racial categories they were attempting to apply. Julian was enslaved after his survival, sold into bondage despite having been a free member of Bellamy's crew, and later killed a man while attempting to escape. The colonial authorities executed him. His story is a reminder that the democracy of the pirate ship, whatever its internal reality, existed within a world that was not democratic at all, and that men who escaped the bonds of hierarchy at sea could be recaptured by those bonds the moment they touched shore. Among the artifacts recovered from the Whydah are objects that almost certainly belong to the black members of Bellamy's crew, though attribution to specific individuals is impossible. African trade beads, yes, but also European goods that had passed through African hands, objects that traveled from Europe to Africa to the Caribbean, to the North Atlantic, in the vast circular trade that defined the economy of the era. These objects resist simple narratives. They do not tell us whether their owners were freed slaves or free-born Africans, whether they joined the pirates by choice or by coercion, whether they found genuine equality aboard the Whydah or merely a different form of exploitation. The artifacts can confirm presence. They cannot explain experience. What the Whydah site ultimately provides is a material record of a world that existed briefly, violently, and almost entirely outside the systems of documentation that preserved other aspects of early 18th century life. Pirates kept few records. They had every reason not to. The evidence of their crimes could be used to hang them, and the wise pirate left as little evidence as possible. This is why the documentary record is so sparse, why we know so little about so many of the thousands of men who took to piracy in the decades following the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. They did not want to be known. They did not want to be remembered. They wanted to plunder and survive and perhaps retire to spend their takings in some quiet corner of the world where no one would ask questions. Bellamy was different. He made speeches. He articulated a philosophy. He left enough of an impression that his contemporaries recorded his words or versions of his words and passed them down for later generations to study. But even so, what survives in the documentary record is fragmentary, mediated through hostile witnesses, shaped by the biases of those who wrote it down. The Whydah site offers something different, the physical reality of pirate life, unmediated by interpretation, preserved by the same accident that destroyed the ship and killed her crew. The excavation has also revealed details about the final moments of the Whydah that the documentary record could not provide. The distribution of the debris field, mapped over decades of careful excavation, tells a story of catastrophic structural failure. The ship did not sink intact. She broke apart, probably when her hull struck the sandbar, her weakened structure unable to withstand the combined forces of impact and storm surge. The heavy objects, cannons, anchors, the densest cargo, went down first, while lighter materials were scattered by the currents across a wide area. The bodies would have been thrown into the water as the ship disintegrated, tumbled through the surf zone, drowned or crushed or broken against the shore. The two survivors somehow made it through this chaos. 143 men did not. Barry Clifford has spent 4 decades now working the Whydah site. He has become, in the process, one of the most controversial figures in maritime archaeology, praised by some as a pioneer who proved that pirate shipwrecks could be found and studied, criticized by others for methods that prioritized recovery over preservation, for the commercial aspects of his operation, for the inevitable compromises that come with private sector archaeology in a field that would prefer academic rigor over treasure hunting. The debates about his methods are beyond the scope of this account. What cannot be debated is the result. The Whydah has been found. Her artifacts have been recovered, conserved, studied, and displayed. More than 200,000 objects, some of enormous historical significance and some merely poignant, now exist in collections where scholars and the public can study them. Without Clifford's obsession, his persistence, his willingness to spend years searching for a ship that most experts believed would never be found, all of this would still be buried beneath the sands of Cape Cod, unknown and unknowable. The artifacts themselves have traveled. A museum in Provincetown, on Cape Cod, houses a permanent exhibition of Whydah material, allowing visitors to see the bell that confirmed the ship's identity, the coins and weapons and personal effects that survived the wreck. Touring exhibitions have taken the story to audiences across the country and around the world. The Whydah has become, improbably, one of the most famous shipwrecks in history, not because more people died aboard her than in other wrecks, or because her sinking was more dramatic than countless other maritime disasters, but because she was a pirate ship, because her captain was young and articulate and died romantically, and because, against all odds, her physical remains were found and verified in an era when most pirate wrecks had long since been given up as lost forever. The discovery also settled, once and for all, questions that had lingered for nearly 3 centuries. The Whydah was not a legend. She was not an exaggeration. She was not a convenient fiction onto which later generations projected their fantasies about pirate treasure and pirate freedom. She was real. The gold was real. The ship was real. The men who sailed her and died aboard her were real. This confirmation may seem unnecessary. The colonial documents had always recorded her loss. The trial records had always attested to her existence. But there is a difference between documentary evidence and physical proof, between accounts and artifacts, between reading about the past and holding a piece of it in your hands. The bell in particular has become an icon. That single object, with its inscription naming the ship and the year of her construction, has done more to fix the Whydah in public memory than all the coins and cannons combined. It is the signature, the proof, the unanswerable argument against skepticism. Every newspaper account of the discovery led with the bell. Every museum exhibit centers on the bell. When people who know nothing else about the Whydah know anything at all, they know about the bell, the name engraved in bronze, the word that has survived while the ship and her crew did not. There is something fitting in this. The Whydah's name derives from the West African port of Ouidah in what is now Benin, one of the major embarkation points for the transatlantic slave trade. The ship was named for a place of suffering, a place where African men, women, and children were loaded into the holds of vessels designed to maximize human cargo and minimize human dignity. That name, cast in bronze and buried for 3 centuries beneath American sands, has now become a memorial, not just to the pirates who captured the ship, but to the system that built her, the trade that funded her, the lives that were destroyed in her holds before ever Bellamy saw her. The bell carries all of this meaning, whether its makers intended it to or not. It names the ship, but the ship's name carries its own history, and that history cannot be forgotten simply because we prefer to remember Bellamy and his men. The physical evidence has also forced a reconsideration of certain comfortable assumptions about pirate life and pirate egalitarianism. The material record does not lie. Among the artifacts recovered from the Whydah are objects of vastly different quality and value: fine silk beside rough canvas, gold rings beside cheap brass buttons, elegant pistols beside serviceable muskets. If pirate crews were truly egalitarian, if all men aboard shared equally in everything, why would some possess luxuries while others made do with necessities? The answer, of course, is that pirate democracy was never as pure as the legends suggest. Men voted on major decisions, yes. Captains served at the pleasure of their crews, yes. But personal property was personal, and some men were better at acquiring it than others. Some came aboard with skills that commanded higher shares. Some were more ruthless in claiming prizes. Some were simply luckier. The democracy of the pirate ship was a democracy of procedure, not a democracy of outcome. It redistributed power without necessarily redistributing wealth. And yet, even qualified, even complicated, even stripped of its romantic excess, the democracy of the pirate ship was something genuinely unusual for its time and place. These men elected their captains. They voted on their destinations. They operated under written articles that guaranteed certain rights and certain shares. They did all of this in an era when most human beings had no say whatsoever in the conditions of their lives, when deference to authority was assumed and enforced, when the idea that common sailors might govern themselves would have struck most respectable observers as lunacy. The pirates were not saints. They were not revolutionaries in any modern sense, but they were something. They created something. And the Whydah, in her brief existence as a pirate flagship, was one of the places where that something flourished. The artifacts continue to surface. More than 200,000 individual objects have been recovered from the Whydah site since Barry Clifford first located the wreck in 1984, and the excavation is not finished. Every season brings new fragments to the light: coins and cutlery, buttons and buckles, pistol balls and shoe leather, fragments of rope and scraps of textile, the ordinary detritus of human existence made extraordinary by survival and context. Each object is a sentence in a language we are still learning to read, a word in a story that was never written down by those who lived it. The pirates left no memoirs. They kept no journals that survived. What we know of their daily lives, we know largely through the hostile accounts of their captors and their victims, through court records and execution sermons, through the propaganda of an empire that needed them to be monsters. The artifacts offer something different. They offer the unspoken testimony of things, the mute evidence of what men owned and used and valued, the physical traces of lives that would otherwise exist only as rumors and accusations. Consider the coins. Thousands of them have been recovered from the site, representing the full geographic range of Atlantic commerce in the early 18th century. Spanish pieces of 8 predominate, as they would have on any ship carrying wealth in that era. Spain's silver mines in the Americas made her currency the de facto standard of international trade. But there are also English shillings and Portuguese cruzados, Dutch guilders and French louis d'or, a numismatic survey of the Atlantic world in miniature. Some of these coins were minted decades before the Whydah sailed, passed from hand to hand across continents and oceans before ending in a pirate's pocket. Some were fresh from the mint, their edges still sharp, their faces still clear. Together they represent not just wealth, but movement, the constant circulation of metal that tracked and enabled the circulation of goods and people across the Atlantic. The pirates captured this flow and diverted it, like men damming a river and redirecting the water to their own mills. The coins they carried were the distilled essence of Atlantic commerce, the crystallized labor of miners in Mexico and Peru, of planters in Barbados and Jamaica, of merchants in Bristol and Amsterdam, of enslaved people whose names and numbers we will never know. Consider the weapons. The Whydah carried an arsenal sufficient to outfit a small army: pistols and muskets, cutlasses and boarding axes, swivel guns and great cannons. Many of these have been recovered, some in remarkable condition given their centuries beneath the sea. They tell a story of preparation for violence, of men who expected to fight and who armed themselves accordingly. But they also tell a story of restraint. The documentary record suggests that Bellamy and his crew preferred to take prizes without bloodshed when possible, that they relied on intimidation and reputation as much as actual firepower. The weapons were instruments of threat as much as instruments of harm. Their very presence on the Whydah, their numbers, their quality, their state of readiness, was itself a message to any merchant captain who might consider resistance. Look at what we carry. Look at what we are prepared to do. Surrender now and no one needs to die. The weapons that have survived are thus artifacts of a kind of negotiation, the physical props in a repeated drama of confrontation and capitulation that usually ended without a shot being fired. Consider the personal effects. Among the artifacts are items that speak to individual identity rather than collective activity: rings and pendants, buttons with distinctive designs, fragments of clothing that suggest personal style or preference. One of the most haunting recoveries is a small silk stocking, remarkably preserved, clearly belonging to someone who cared about appearance even in the midst of a pirate cruise. Who wore it? We cannot know. A captain dressing for negotiations with a captured merchant? A quartermaster asserting his status among his peers? A common sailor with a taste for finery that his previous life could never have afforded? The stocking survives, but its owner does not, and the distance between them, between the thing and the person who once owned it, is the distance that archaeology can narrow but never close. We can hold what they held. We cannot know what they thought as they held it. The excavation of the Whydah has also recovered human remains, bones and bone fragments, the last traces of the men who died in the wreck. These recoveries raise difficult questions, ethical as well as historical. Whose bones are these? The crew of the Whydah included men of European, African, and Native American descent. The artifacts suggest diversity. The bones confirm it. Forensic analysis has identified remains from individuals of different ancestries, different ages, different physical conditions. Some show signs of hard physical labor. Some bear the marks of healed injuries. One skull fragment, examined by forensic anthropologists, belonged to a man of African descent who was probably in his 20s when he died. Who was he? Was he one of the pirates who sailed willingly under Bellamy's command, a free man making his own choices on a free ship? Or was he one of the enslaved people whom the Whydah had carried before her capture, pressed into service by the pirates who took her? The bones cannot tell us. The bones can only tell us that he existed, that he was aboard, that he died. This is one of the silences that the artifacts cannot fill. The Whydah was a slave ship before she was a pirate ship. She was built for the purpose of transporting human beings in conditions that would today be recognized as torture. When Bellamy captured her, she had already completed her crossing, had already delivered her human cargo to the markets of the Caribbean. The enslaved people who suffered in her holds are not represented in the archaeological record. They had been sold off, dispersed into the plantation system, their connection to the ship severed before the ship became a prize. But their absence haunts the artifacts nonetheless. The gold and silver and ivory that Bellamy captured were the profits of their sale. The wealth that made the Whydah so desirable a prize was wealth extracted from their labor and their suffering. When we marvel at the fortune that Bellamy accumulated, we should remember where that fortune came from. It came from human trafficking. It came from the most brutal commerce in human history. The pirates did not create this system. They merely raided its profits. But their complicity in it, their willingness to accept wealth derived from slavery, their own retention of enslaved people as servants and crew members, is part of their history too, and the artifacts force us to confront it. The physical evidence has complicated the narrative in other ways as well. For decades, popular accounts of the Whydah disaster emphasized the scale of the treasure lost, the gold and silver and gems that supposedly went down with the ship, a fortune so vast that treasure hunters spent years searching for it. The reality, as revealed by excavation, is more complex. Yes, there was treasure aboard. Yes, the coins recovered number in the tens of thousands, but the total value, while substantial, falls short of the most extravagant estimates. Some of this may be explained by dispersion. The wreck site is scattered across a wide area, and not all of it has been excavated. Some may be explained by earlier salvage attempts, by the colonists who rode out to the wreck in the days after the storm and pulled what they could from the debris before authorities arrived to stop them. But some of the gap between legend and evidence may simply be a gap between legend and reality. Pirates were not always as rich as they claimed to be. Their prizes were not always as valuable as their victims reported. The mythology of pirate wealth served everyone's purposes. The pirates for intimidation, the merchants for insurance claims, the newspapers for sensational copy. But mythology is not fact. The Whydah was rich. She was not as rich as the legend suggested. The distinction matters because it speaks to the larger question of what piracy actually accomplished, of whether the risks were commensurate with the rewards, of whether any of it made sense in terms of rational self-interest. For many pirates, the answer was no. Most died young and poor, executed or killed in action or shipwrecked, having enjoyed a few months or years of freedom followed by violent death. The great fortunes were anomalies. The typical pirate career was nasty, brutish, and short. The Whydah's treasure, even at its real value, was exceptional. Most pirates never captured a prize a tenth as valuable, and yet men continued to go a-pirating, continued to choose the black flag over the merchant service or the navy or the honest poverty of life ashore. Why? The artifacts offer one kind of answer. Among the objects recovered from the Whydah are items of everyday comfort and pleasure. Gaming pieces, musical instruments, fine fabrics, quality food and drink. These men lived well for a time. They ate better than they would have eaten aboard a merchant vessel, where rations were meager and often spoiled. They dressed better than they would have dressed as common sailors, where slop clothing was the norm and personal expression was discouraged. They enjoyed freedoms that were unavailable to them anywhere else in the Atlantic world, freedom to speak, to vote, to move, to refuse orders they considered unjust. The artifacts of daily life aboard the Whydah are artifacts of pleasure as well as utility, of men who had decided that a short life of autonomy and abundance was preferable to a long life of deprivation and subordination. We may question their judgment, we may note the bodies on the seafloor, the years they never lived, the futures they foreclosed, but we should not pretend that their choice made no sense. It made a kind of sense. It made exactly the kind of sense that desperation makes when hope is the only alternative to despair. The legacy of the Whydah extends beyond the artifacts themselves. The discovery and excavation of the wreck has transformed our understanding of the material culture of Atlantic piracy, providing a baseline against which other claims and accounts can be measured. Before the Whydah, everything we knew about pirate ships came from documents, inventories and depositions, newspaper accounts and trial records. These documents are invaluable, but they are also mediated by the perspectives and purposes of those who created them. A merchant describing the ship that robbed him had every incentive to exaggerate her armament and her ferocity. A court recording the cargo of a captured vessel had every incentive to maximize the apparent value of the prize. The Whydah offers a corrective, a physical anchor to which the documentary record can be tethered. When we read an account of a pirate ship carrying 50 guns, we can now ask, is that plausible, given what we know about how such vessels were actually constructed and armed? When we read a description of a pirate crew numbering in the hundreds, we can ask, could a ship of that size actually accommodate that many men, given the spatial constraints revealed by the Waida's own dimensions? The archaeology does not replace the documents, it disciplines them. It provides a reality against which the rhetoric of the past can be tested. The Waida has also become a touchstone for questions about commemoration and responsibility. The ship and her crew have been memorialized in museums and documentaries, in books and articles, in the tourist economy of Cape Cod. But whose story is being told in these commemorations? The pirates who sailed her for a few brief months, or the enslaved Africans who suffered in her holds during her voyage from Ouida to Jamaica? The name on the bell, that famous bell, that iconic artifact, commemorates a slaving port. Every time we invoke the Waida, every time we celebrate the discovery of her wreck and marvel at the treasures recovered from her grave, we are also invoking Ouida, also invoking the traffic in human beings that gave the ship her name and her wealth. This is not a comfortable recognition. It sits uneasily alongside the romantic narratives of pirate freedom and pirate democracy. But it is a necessary recognition, a moral weight that any honest account of the Waida must carry. The ship cannot be separated from her history. The name cannot be stripped of its meaning. The human remains recovered from the site have become a particular focus of these tensions. Some have argued that the bones should be treated as the bones of criminals, men who chose lives of violence and died as a consequence of their choices. Others have argued that they should be treated as the bones of any shipwreck victims, with respect and dignity regardless of how they lived. Still others have noted that we cannot be certain whose bones these are, that among them may be the remains of enslaved people who did not choose to be aboard, who were not pirates but captives, whose presence on the ship was itself a form of victimization. The debates continue. The bones remain in the custody of the excavation project, neither buried nor displayed, suspended in a kind of ethical limbo while scholars and stakeholders argue about what should be done with them. There are no easy answers. The dead cannot speak for themselves, and the living disagree about how to speak for them. Meanwhile, the excavation continues. Each summer, when conditions permit, divers return to the site off Wellfleet and probe the seafloor for additional artifacts. The wreck is not exhausted. There is more to find, more to learn, more to recover. The Waida has been giving up her secrets for 4 decades now, and she has more to give. Every season brings the possibility of new discoveries, a previously unknown type of artifact, a previously unrecognized pattern in the distribution of debris, a previously overlooked connection between what lies on the seafloor and what we know from documentary sources. The project has outlived many of the people who began it. Barry Clifford, who located the wreck in 1984, is still involved, but he is no longer young, and the work will eventually pass to other hands. The Waida will continue to be excavated long after everyone who found her is gone. This is one of the strange features of archaeology, its temporal dilation, its extension across generations of researchers. The ship sank in 1717. She was discovered in 1984. She will still be yielding artifacts well into the 21st century, perhaps into the 22nd. The story of the Waida is not a story with a fixed ending, because the evidence is not all in, because each new artifact adds something to our understanding, because the meanings we make of the past change as we ourselves change. The pirates who sailed her are dead and have been dead for 3 centuries, but the ship continues to speak, continues to offer testimony, continues to force us to reckon with questions we thought we had answered. And what of the romantic legend that brought so much attention to the discovery in the first place? What of Maria Hallett, the Witch of Wellfleet, the woman who supposedly walked the dunes for decades, waiting for a lover who would never return? The archaeology has nothing to say about her. The artifacts are silent on the subject of love letters and broken promises of a young woman watching the sea from the bluffs of Cape Cod. If there was a Maria Hallett, if she existed in anything like the form the legends describe, she left no trace in the material record. The coins and cannons, the buttons and bones, the silk stockings and gaming pieces, none of these can confirm or deny the story that the locals have been telling for 300 years. The legend persists in a different register than the evidence, answerable to different standards, serving different purposes. And yet the legend will not go away. It has proven more durable than the ship itself, more permanent than bronze or gold. People continue to tell the story of Black Sam and his Maria, of the pirate who went to sea to make his fortune and almost made it home, of the woman who waited and became something strange in her waiting. The story persists because it offers something that history alone cannot provide: a shape, a meaning, a reason. The historical Bellamy died in a storm because storms happen, because wooden ships break, because the sea is indifferent to human purposes. The legendary Bellamy died within sight of his love, because tragedy requires proximity, because the cruelest fate is the one that comes closest to mercy before snatching it away. We tell the story of Maria Hallett because we need the death to mean something, because we cannot bear the alternative, that it meant nothing at all, that a man can accumulate the greatest fortune in pirate history and die before spending any of it for no reason except weather and bad luck. The wind that killed Bellamy blows still. The Atlantic that swallowed the Whydah remains as indifferent now as it was on the night of April 26, 1717. The sandbars off Wellfleet shift with every season, rearranging themselves according to dynamics that have nothing to do with human memory or human desire. The ocean does not preserve legends. The ocean preserves bronze and gold and bone, material things that persist because their composition resists the dissolving power of salt water. The legend of Maria Hallett persists for different reasons, because people tell it, because it satisfies a need, because it makes the death of Samuel Bellamy into something other than an accident. But perhaps the distinction between legend and history is not as clean as we would like to believe. Perhaps the legend itself is a kind of artifact, shaped by the same forces that shaped the coins and cannons now displayed in the museum. Stories, after all, do not emerge from nothing. They are crafted by specific hands in specific circumstances, passed down through specific communities, modified by specific tellers to serve specific purposes. The legend of Maria Hallett is an artifact of Cape Cod culture, as surely as a whalebone corset stay is an artifact of 18th century fashion. Both tell us something about the people who made them and the world they inhabited. The earliest written versions of the Hallett legend appear in the 19th century, more than 100 years after Bellamy's death. By then, Cape Cod had transformed itself from a colonial backwater into a center of the American whaling industry, and the old pirate stories had acquired a certain romantic patina that they lacked when the events were still within living memory. The men who actually remembered the Whydah disaster, the farmers and fishermen who found bodies washing up on the beach in 1717, who watched the colonial authorities hang the surviving pirates in Boston, those men had no interest in romanticizing what had happened. To them, the wreck was a catastrophe that brought trouble and attention to their community, that required them to deal with corpses and courts and the disruption of their ordinary lives. The romance came later, when the disaster had passed beyond living memory into the realm of story. And this is perhaps the most honest thing we can say about Samuel Bellamy. We do not know him. We know what he did, or at least some of what he did. We know the ships he took and the routes he sailed and the manner of his death. We know the material traces he left behind, the artifacts now scattered across museum displays, the court records that document the trial of his surviving crew, the newspaper accounts that reported his activities with varying degrees of accuracy. But the man himself, the interior life of the poor Devonshire farm boy who went to sea at 12 and died at 28 with a fortune in his holds, remains as inaccessible to us as any figure from the deep past. The speeches attributed to him may be real. They may be inventions of the journalists who reported them or the historians who recorded them. The relationship with Maria Hallett may have happened. It may be pure fabrication, a legend grafted onto a historical figure to make his story conform to the shape we expect tragic stories to take. The nickname Black Sam may reflect his actual appearance. It may be a later addition, a colorful detail that someone thought the story needed. We cannot verify any of it. We can only note what the sources say and acknowledge the uncertainty that surrounds them. What we can say with confidence is that Bellamy's death ended one of the most remarkable pirate careers in the historical record. In just over a year of active piracy, He had captured more ships and accumulated more wealth than men who sailed for decades. He had risen from common sailor to elected captain of one of the most powerful pirate fleets in the Atlantic. He had done all this before his 29th birthday. And then the storm took him, and all the skill and luck and daring that had carried him so far could not carry him through that final night. The Whydah broke apart on the shoals off Wellfleet sometime around midnight on April 26, 1717. The precise sequence of events is impossible to reconstruct with certainty. The two survivors gave testimony, but their accounts are fragmentary, colored by trauma, filtered through the questions of their interrogators. What we know is that the ship struck bottom, that the force of impact snapped her masts, that the hull began to disintegrate in the pounding surf, that the men aboard were thrown into water so cold that survival was measured in minutes rather than hours. Thomas Davis and John Julian survived because they happened to be on the right part of the ship when it broke, because they were strong enough swimmers to reach the shore, because their bodies were capable of withstanding the cold long enough to make the swim. Nothing about their survival was guaranteed. Nothing about it reflected superior virtue or skill. They lived because the particular configuration of chaos that night happened to deliver them to shore rather than to the bottom. 143 other men, including Samuel Bellamy, were not so fortunate. Their bodies washed up on the beach over the following days. The local authorities, led by the provincial governor Samuel Shute and the justice of the peace John Doane, organized the recovery and identification effort. The dead were buried in mass graves along the shore, their exact locations now uncertain, lost to the erosion and development of 3 centuries. The living, Davis and Julian, along with 6 other pirates captured from the smaller vessels in Bellamy's fleet, were transported to Boston to stand trial. The trial itself was swift by the standards of any era. The pirates were charged with robbery, piracy, and murder. Their defense was limited. Most simply threw themselves on the mercy of the court, claiming they had been forced into piracy against their will. This was a standard defense in pirate trials, sometimes true, often not. The court believed some defendants and rejected others. Of the 9 men tried, 6 were convicted and hanged. Thomas Davis, the carpenter who had been forced from a captured vessel and who had witnesses to corroborate his story of compulsion, was acquitted. John Julian, the Cape Cod Indian who had been Bellamy's pilot, was sold into slavery, a fate that the court apparently considered a form of mercy, since he was spared the gallows. The executions took place on November 15, 1717, at Charlestown Ferry in Boston Harbor. The condemned men were brought to the gallows in a procession designed to maximize their public humiliation and the deterrent effect of their deaths. Cotton Mather, the famous Puritan minister, attended the execution and preached a sermon. His pamphlet, Instructions to the Living from the Condition of the Dead, used the pirates as an object lesson in the wages of sin. The bodies of the executed men were displayed along the harbor as a warning to other sailors who might be tempted by the pirate life. And so ended the White Company. Some drowned, some hanged, one enslaved, one acquitted, all scattered to fates that would never have intersected had they not at some point in their various lives made the choice or been forced into the circumstance that put them aboard that doomed ship. But what of the fortune that went down with them? The treasure that Bellamy had accumulated over his year of raiding, the gold and silver and ivory from the African trade, the coins and currency from a dozen captured vessels. All of it lay beneath the sand and water off Wellfleet, theoretically recoverable, practically inaccessible. The colonial authorities made attempts to salvage what they could. Governor Shute ordered recovery efforts, and some treasure was indeed brought up in the weeks following the wreck. But the technology of the early 18th century was not equal to the task. The wreckage lay in 30 feet of water, scattered across a debris field that the shifting sands continually buried and uncovered. Divers could make short descents with the primitive equipment available, but systematic excavation was impossible. After the initial recovery efforts yielded diminishing returns, the project was abandoned. And there the treasure lay, for centuries. Generations of Cape Codders grew up with stories of the Whydah, with the knowledge that somewhere offshore lay a fortune in pirate gold. Occasional storms would uncover artifacts on the beach, coins, fragments of ship's timbers, other remnants that kept the legend alive. But the main body of the wreck remained out of reach, waiting for the technology and the determination that would eventually bring it back into the light. The waiting lasted 267 years. In 1984, Barry Clifford's team located the first artifacts, and the long process of excavation began. It continues today, nearly 4 decades later, and will likely continue for decades more. The Whydah has already yielded more than 200,000 artifacts, the largest collection of pirate-related objects ever recovered from a single site. Each artifact carries its own story, its own connection to the men who handled it, the systems that produced it, the catastrophe that preserved it. There is the ship's bell, inscribed, "The Whydah Galley 1716, the definitive proof that Clifford had found what he was looking for. There are the coins, thousands of them, from mints across the Atlantic world, Spanish pieces of 8, English shillings, French livres, Portuguese reis, the monetary detritus of an empire built on maritime commerce. There are the weapons, pistols and cutlasses, boarding axes and grenades, the tools of the pirate trade. There are the navigational instruments, compasses and dividers, the technology that allowed 18th century sailors to find their way across the trackless ocean. And there are the human remains. The excavation has recovered the skeletal fragments of several individuals, most notably a nearly complete skull and femur that were found in 1985. Analysis of these remains has provided information about the physical characteristics of the pirates, their ages, their heights, their injuries and ailments. The teeth show signs of scurvy and malnutrition. The bones show evidence of healed fractures, of the hard labor that characterized a sailor's life. These are not the bones of wealthy men or comfortable men. They are the bones of workers who lived hard and died young, who came from the lower orders of society and remained there despite all the treasure they accumulated. More recently, advances in genetic analysis have made it possible to extract DNA from the skeletal remains to determine ancestry and potential family relationships. Some of the individuals whose remains were found can now be tentatively identified, their African ancestry confirmed, their placement within the ship's diverse crew established with greater certainty. The bones are speaking, 3 centuries after the men they belonged to stopped breathing. But the bones do not speak of love. They do not speak of Maria Hallett, of promises made on a Cape Cod beach, of a young man's resolution to return wealthy to claim his bride. They speak of nutrition and disease, of ancestry and age at death, of the physical toll that 18th century maritime labor extracted from the bodies that performed it. The legend and the evidence occupy different territories, answer different questions, satisfy different hungers. And this, perhaps, is the final meaning of the Whydah story. Not the treasure, not the tragedy, not the romance, but the gap between what we want history to be and what history actually is. We want Bellamy's death to mean something. We want the story to have a shape, a beginning, a middle, an end that resonates with significance. We want Maria Hallett waiting on the bluffs, giving his death the tragic dignity of thwarted love. We want the storm to be fate, not weather. We want the gold to represent something beyond mere wealth, freedom, perhaps, or defiance, or the promise of a better life. But the evidence does not cooperate with our desires. The evidence tells us that a ship sank in a storm, that men drowned, that some treasure was lost and some recovered, that artifacts corrode at different rates, depending on their material composition and the chemistry of the water that surrounds them. The evidence tells us what it can, and no more. The legend fills the gaps that the evidence leaves open. It provides the meaning that the artifacts cannot supply. And perhaps this is not a failure, but a feature, not a deficiency in our understanding, but a recognition that human beings require more than mere facts to make sense of their existence. The legend of Maria Hallett is not a lie. It is a story that a community has chosen to tell about itself, about its past, about the kinds of meanings that matter to the people who live in a particular place and share a particular history. Cape Cod has been telling this story for 300 years. It will likely tell it for 300 more. The details will shift with each generation of tellers, adapting to new circumstances, new values, new understandings of what the past meant and what the present requires. But the core will remain. A pirate who almost made it home, a woman who waited, a treasure lost to the sea. These are the elements that persist because they satisfy something deep in the human need for narrative shape. The Whydah herself lies still beneath the sand and water off Wellfleet. The excavation continues. Each season brings new artifacts to the surface, new pieces of the puzzle, new data to be cataloged and analyzed and interpreted. The work is meticulous and slow, as archaeological work must be, destructive by nature, irreversible, requiring a caution that the pirates themselves never exercised. The men who sailed the Whydah acted quickly, decisively, violently when necessary. The men who excavate her remains act slowly, carefully, recording every detail, preserving every fragment, aware that they are the first and last to see these objects in their burial context. Someday the excavation will be complete. Someday, every artifact that can be recovered will have been recovered. Every analysis that can be performed will have been performed. Every interpretation that can be offered will have been offered. The Whydah will have yielded everything she has to yield, and the site will fall silent again, empty of treasure, empty of secrets. But the meaning will not be exhausted. The meaning will continue to shift and grow and change, because meaning is not something objects possess, but something humans make. The people of 2117, looking back on the Whydah from the distance of 4 centuries, will make different meanings than we make. They will ask different questions, bring different concerns, see different patterns in the same evidence. The ship will remain the same, bronze and gold and bone, matter persisting in the chemistry of the sea, but the significance will evolve. And Samuel Bellamy himself? What becomes of him in the long arc of memory and forgetting that determines which figures from the past we remember and which we allow to fade? He is not forgotten. The Whydah discovery ensured that, at least for a time. His name appears in books and documentaries, in museum exhibits and tourist materials, in the curriculum of schools within driving distance of Cape Cod. For a generation that grew up after 1984, he is the pirate whose ship was found, the pirate whose treasure was real, the pirate who proved that the golden age of piracy was not merely legend, but historical fact. But memory is fragile, and the competition for attention is fierce. Other pirates have stronger claims on popular imagination. Blackbeard with his burning fuses, Kidd with his buried treasure, the fictional pirates who populate movies and novels and amusement park rides. Bellamy's fame is local rather than universal, specific rather than generic. He is Cape Cod's pirate, New England's pirate, the pirate whose death happened close enough to shore that his treasure could be found. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps local fame is more durable than universal fame, rooted as it is in specific geography, specific traditions, specific communities that have reason to remember. Cape Cod will remember Bellamy as long as Cape Cod exists, as long as tourists come seeking stories, as long as the museum stays open and the legend is told. That is more than most people achieve. That is more than most pirates achieved for all their notoriety in their own time. The wind off Wellfleet blows today as it blew on the night of April 26, 1717. The waves break on the same sandbars, rearranged by 3 centuries of storms and tides, but made of the same sand, subject to the same physics. The Atlantic stretches east toward Africa and the Caribbean, the same Atlantic that Bellamy sailed, the same water that killed him, indifferent then and indifferent now. Somewhere beneath that water, a few feet down in the sand, lie fragments not yet found, a coin perhaps, or a button, or a shard of ceramic, or a bone. They wait in darkness for the trowel that will uncover them, the hands that will lift them into light, the eyes that will see them for the first time since the moment, 300 years ago, when the Whydah broke apart and scattered her cargo across the bottom. They wait. The sea is patient. The sand shifts. The artifacts persist. And on the shore, the legend persists too. Maria Hallett in her long vigil, Black Sam sailing home with his fortune, the storm that took him within sight of everything he wanted. The story requires no archaeology. The story requires no proof. The story requires only telling. and telling again, and telling once more to each new generation that asks to hear it. The teller is different each time, the listeners are different each time, but the story remains, flowing through the centuries like the Gulf Stream through the Atlantic, invisible and persistent and full of secrets. A man went to sea to make his fortune. He made it. He tried to come home. He almost succeeded. The sea kept him. The sand kept his treasure. The people kept his story. That is all. That is enough. That is the Whydah and Samuel Bellamy and 300 years of memory and forgetting, of legend and evidence, of artifacts corroding in salt water and stories persisting in human mouths. The wind blows. The waves break. The work continues. The bell still bears his ship's name, cast in bronze, waiting to be rung by hands that will never touch it again.